got about 20 minutes. So I'm going to give you a bit of it is a very broad brush overview of what I think are some of the main issues and challenges. And those challenges relate not just to the particular experiences and outcomes facing women as asylum seekers or gendered claims more generally, but to the context within which we're now working. And as Moira said, I've been around in this space for a long time, since the late 1980s. At a time when we thought things were terrible and couldn't get any worse, and then sort of watched them subsequently over the decades that have followed deteriorating in many ways. And I think that climate, that cold climate as being described for the seminar series, is the backdrop to thinking about how issues of gender can be addressed in terms of the politics of protection, if you like. And the title of my paper or my presentation comes from a paper that was recently published in Refugee Survey Quarterly, and is really trying to capture some of these issues, again reflecting on what has been a long period of engagement with these issues, and reflections not just on, you know, the world out there and how it's changing and how it's becoming more difficult, but also how we, as, if you like, activist academics or advocates in other ways, are engaging with, representing and challenging some of the things that are happening. So in my brief presentation, as I say, I want to do very broad brush. I want to talk a little bit about the politics of refugee protection in general, the context, if you like, and the fact that we are operating within what is clearly a shrinking protection space for lots of different reasons. But the history of that is not a recent one. In fact, I would argue, and I argue in the paper, that the whole system of refugee protection was set up from the get-go with this embedded set of assumptions about who is and is not deserving of international protection. And within that, the way that we think about the experiences of refugee women as a category, if you like, both in practical terms, but also in how we imagine those experiences to be and how they sit in this world that we've constructed politically and legally to respond to those experiences, how those then shape and limit, actually, I would argue, the possibilities in a way. And so it's a kind of reflective piece, I guess, on that history of engagement. And I think, importantly, and hopefully handing over to what Sandra has to say, which is hopefully a bit more practical, the kind of so what, where next, because I think a lot of us have problematized this area for a long time, but, you know, we also want to change things. So what do we need to do about the way in which we engage with those things to actually make a difference, which is what many of us are here for. So just to begin with the kind of broad brush of the politics of refugee protection, I'm sure, telling you anything you don't already know, but a kind of, you know, step back reminder of where we're at, certainly in the UK context, but also, I would say, much more generally. So the process of refugee status determination is often presented as if it's a kind of very straightforward and objective legal process. And we know in reality, of course, that it is, and it always has been, deeply political, often providing protection in line with political interests and allegiances of states, which is why you see, you know, some nationalities more likely to be granted protection in some contexts in some countries than others, even though the kind of realities from which they're seeking protection are exactly the same. So those realities are interpreted differently depending on the political interests and allegiances of the states in which those people then claim protection. Sorry, now having a little technical issue. Not sure what's happened there. And one of the consequences of that, in the broadest sense, is that those whose experiences don't conform to what is essentially an increasingly narrow definition or stereotype of what a genuine refugee is. I use that in common because, of course, you know, this language of asylum seeker, refugee, genuine asylum seeker, genuine refugee has become highly politicized. But those people who don't in some way conform to these stereotypical expectations have increasingly struggled to secure access to international protection. So clearly in that category are women who are engaging, for example, in gendered forms of resistance that are not typically seen as political, persecution on the basis of sexual identity or relationships, the kinds of issues that many of us have been grappling with for a long time. And the focus of, therefore, much of the feminist lobbying and advocacy that's taken place since the late 1980s, and some of which I've been involved in, has really been about how to, if you like, highlight the ways in which these gender-specific and gender-related forms of persecution fall very legitimately within the meaning of the, 51 convention, not 61, often reflected in detailed legal challenges over the construction of particular convention grounds, and particular social group has been one of those where there's been lots of contestations about the legitimacy or otherwise of gendered asylum claims. And the work of the Refugee Women's Legal Group, which was established in the mid-1990s, not dissimilar from WiRL in the sense that it was a kind of group of academics and advocates trying to change and highlight the way in which gender-related claims were dealt with. We produced the gender guidance in the UK, campaigned for things like childcare during asylum interviews for a long time. That was exactly what we were trying to do, in a way, was to sort of really show the legitimacy of those claims and why they were relevant to the convention, and therefore why those people should be given protection, and how you could make the system in some ways more gender sensitive to the needs of those particular individuals, particularly where they had children. Meanwhile, at the same time as we've been trying to sort of shift some of the thinking around the legitimacy of these claims, we've had very definitely and very clearly a shrinking protection space for everybody. So it's not just that women as a category or particular groups of marginalized individuals within the system have struggled to get protection. It's that everybody has been finding it increasingly difficult to access the protection to which they're potentially entitled. So migration in general, and I would say asylum in particular, has been increasingly positioned as central to political debates, not just about the legitimacy or otherwise of someone's claim for protection, but rather about issues of security, about national or even regional identity in the case of Europe, about the role of the state in terms of how it does or doesn't respond to the needs of vulnerable populations, about whether or not you trust the government to be able to do what it says it's going to do in terms of, for example, controlling migration, and frankly, as a distraction from many other domestic concerns, whether that's a shortage of housing or zero-hour contracts or problems with the healthcare system or anything that really the government would rather you didn't question or challenge them on. So, talk about migration as a distraction in some way from that. And what that has then been reflected in is these very negative migration and asylum narratives, of which, of course, you're all very familiar, I imagine. And not just the narratives, but also the concrete policy changes with which they've been associated. And they've had very significant implications for those seeking asylum in the UK as elsewhere, most notably in terms of access to protection itself, the increased securitization of borders, the increased use of detention, new rules which effectively limit the potential to claim asylum depending on your route and when you claim asylum and where you claim asylum. So it's actually made it very difficult for a lot of people in general, not just women at all, to be able to access protection. And I think one of the interesting things, and really kind of the focus of the paper in a way, although the paper is specifically from a gender perspective, is that while there's been extensive advocacy and campaigning against these changes, there remains really very little discussion of how they came to be like that in the first place. Very little discussion of colonialism, of post-colonialism, or indeed the need for decolonization in studies of gender and international refugee law. And that's despite the fact that the politics of migration, and you can see it, you can read it, you can hear it, is deeply racialized as well as gendered. We know it's deeply gendered, but we also know it to be deeply racialized. And the fact that in our conversations often about gender and protection, international protection, we rarely talk about race, I think this is really the kind of starting point, if you like, for some of my critique. And that really stems from acknowledging the legacy of colonialism in particular in terms of the structures, well, in terms of the context, of course, from which women are often seeking protection, which are contexts in which colonization in its various forms, including contemporary forms, have shaped the kinds of structures and systems that exist in terms of women's ability to have access to protection and rights. but also in terms of the system of asylum that's been structured in the global north to respond to those particular claims. Now, I think there's a really excellent book by Lucy Mablin and Joe Turner, and if you haven't read it, I recommend that you do. It's a really very useful kind of, again, broad brush overview of the relationship between colonization and asylum and migration more generally, and its implications for migration governance, contemporary forms of migration governance now. And I think they really show very strongly and clearly that our failure sometimes to acknowledge those histories and to understand where the asylum system came from, they really do us a disservice in terms of how we then go about engaging with the contemporary system that we're working with. And they argue, I think it's very clear in the book, and of course there are many others making the same case, that colonial interests shaped the drafting of the 51 Convention, including excluding from the provisions of the Convention millions of those who had been displaced in the global south by colonization. So by those processes. And the examples that are often cited are the examples of India in terms of partition, and the examples of Palestine as contemporarily manifested, of course, neither of which were legitimate subjects for people to be able to seek protection under the 51 Convention. So these examples, and there are many others, are used to sort of say, well, actually, how was that system constructed? It was constructed in the interest of the global north. And it was based on this idea of a myth of difference, as Chimney has called it, in which both the nature and the character of refugee flows from the global south were represented as being fundamentally different from those in the north, and specifically Europe, where, of course, the convention was drafted. So as Chimney says, an image of a normal refugee was constructed as white, as male, and of course as anti-communist, and that clashed very sharply with this image of individuals fleeing the so-called third world. So this whole construction of the kind of legitimacy of someone who needs international protection is based on this very strong myth of difference. And therefore, Chimney and others would argue the definition of a refugee was thus racialized by design and, of course, by effect. So if we ignore that when we're thinking about the issues facing refugee women seeking protection, then we're ignoring that broad political context within which women's claims are both formulated and, of course, ultimately assessed. So the importance of this, and I realize that, 5 bullet points and 1 slide is not sufficient to be able to really spell out the point, but the point of it for the purpose of this discussion is that those ongoing consequences of colonization, of structural inequalities, and of racism have very significant implications for contemporary forms of migration, including refugee flows, and contemporary responses to those refugees' flows. And if we don't acknowledge that, and if we don't then understand how we operate within that context, then we, I think, are in danger of reproducing and replicating some of the very things that we find to be problematic about the system. And one of the ways that I've argued in the paper, and I have also argued historically, more through the critique of the law, but also in terms of the narrative construction, is that in the discussions about the rights or otherwise for refugee women to seek and avail themselves of protection, a very particular category has emerged of refugee women that reflects all sorts of assumptions about the experiences of those that move. And refugee women becomes almost a kind of an imagined category by which we think about and we therefore articulate what it is that women's needs and interests might be. And so white feminist scholarship in the global north, and I talk a lot in the paper about what I mean by white feminist scholarship, and I also talk a lot about, kind of post-colonial scholarship, and particularly the work of Gaia Spivak and others. But that scholarship, the scholarship that I've been involved in historically has, as I said, really drawn attention to the challenges facing women seeking protection under international refugee law. And I would argue that, of course, these efforts are absolutely legitimate and valid, and they're very important, and they have undoubtedly improved outcomes for some women, and the really important legal work in particular that's gone on to really make the case why women should and are entitled to protection has been critically important, not in any way, shape or form trying to disregard that or to say it's not significant. But I do think that some of the things that we, and I include myself in this category, I've worked in this space for a long time, have often failed to reconfigure the ways in which gendered experiences of persecution are conceptualized and represented. And by that, I mean that we have feminist responses to international refugee law, as with all responses to international refugee law, have this, what Mablin and Turner would call this colonial blind spot, in the sense that we've really failed to engage with the way in which international refugee law is very deeply entangled with the history of colonization. And in so doing, they and we, in a way, have been, guilty, if you like, of perpetuating this myth of difference. And to give you an example, and the paper gives many examples of very concrete, specific kinds of ways in which this has happened, and some case law as well. But the kind of ways in which this happened is really through this kind of stereotype of this group of women who are in some ways disempowered, helpless victims or exotic others who somehow need to be rescued from their often backward cultures. And I say that because some of the most important case law has been around things like the female genital mutilation, around forced marriage, around the hijab, and things which are quite particular in terms of their gendered forms that they take within different contexts, and which then often have been argued as being examples of why women need to be protected, because the context from which they come from somehow intrinsically are incapable of protecting them, without recognizing that in doing so, we're adopting a kind of quite neo-imperial frame or colonizing frame that reproduces some of these ideas about those in the South somehow being fundamentally different from those in the North in terms of their political engagement. And whenever I talk about these things, I always, before I do the presentation, I always do a quick screenshot, and I did it again today, of what happens if you put refugee women into a search engine, and I'll show you in a minute. But what I want to argue is that these kind of representations are very essentializing, because they require you to, in a way, flatten out what happens to women in different contexts in order to make the case that women in certain countries, for example, particular social groups of women in Pakistan or whatever it might be, are legitimate candidates for protection. So here's my screenshot that I took just before the event, about half an hour ago. You put in into the search engine, in this case Google. It depends where you are as to what you do and what you get, but you get a set of images, often women and children. That's a very typical representation, very often now with hijab, even though that isn't necessarily the predominant basis of the claim, but it's a kind of religiosity that's in the image. And you get these kind of words at the top of other things that might be related that you think you might want to look at: beautiful, sad, pregnant, Arab. So these kind of notions of what a refugee woman looks like and what kind of category you might be thinking about. And my point about this is not that these are not relevant images, not that these are not relevant experiences, but when you're talking about how to ensure that an asylum system, a protection system, protects all of those that are seeking asylum, including women, the idea should not be to therefore say that somehow women need protection because essentially they are being persecuted or at risk of harm from essentially Black or Muslim men, because there has to be a perpetrator in these cases. And the ways in which the narratives are constructed construct the culture, the context as the problem, if you like, but within that, men become the problem, because by definition, they are, the perpetrators, the agents of the state, or the ones from which women cannot be protected. So there's a kind of quid pro quo that in representing women as being victims of these backward cultures and ideas and identities, you have to kind of reinforce the idea of this myth of difference, in which, by definition, men become perpetrators of violence against women. And what that leaves us with is a very difficult conundrum, and one that I'm not going to solve in 1.5 minutes, and we'll kind of hand over to Sandra perhaps to give her thoughts on where we are at with the issues of representation. But for me, the challenge is how to highlight the very legitimate experiences of refugee women seeking protection, or indeed anybody for whom gender is a shaping force in what has happened to them, without simultaneously reinforcing and replicating the highly and deeply racialized systems on which international protection and asylum law is ultimately based, because of where it came from and because of the ways it has become so political now. So I'm going to give you 3 ideas. Again, they come from the paper about what what next might look like. The first one really is that we need to understand and also represent and advocate for the idea that the challenges facing women seeking international protection don't just come exclusively or even primarily from their identities of women, albeit that's a particular manifestation of that, but rather it becomes because women are embedded in systems and structures of inequality and oppression of various kinds. And that in order, therefore, and I've argued this historically in relation to political opinion, for example, in order, therefore, to be able to represent them on their own terms in the context where they are experiencing that harm, you need to understand the inequalities and the oppressions that take place and the particularities of those, rather than just saying, oh, it's women from the third world or the global south who, by definition, are somehow vulnerable victims. We also need to recognize the centrality of race in the workings of international refugee law, both in terms of the history that I've described, but also in terms of contemporary policy and practice. Race and gender do not just intersect, as Achumi has said, they are mutually bound together. Indeed, the racialization that took place during the colonial process was often deeply gendered. And Gaius Spivak, for example, gives this really beautiful and powerful example of Sati as an example of how the colonizers sort of protected and rescued, in this case, Indian women from a colonial, from a cultural practice, and they became the kind of saviors or the heroes in some way, but in so doing misrepresented often the complexities of those cultural practices where they took place. And finally, I think it's really an issue of broadening out our intentions in terms of social justice. We need to really place colonization and history at the center of our thinking about why international refugee law and protection operates in the way that it does. And we really need to be aware that there are dangers in fighting sexism or patriarchy with racism. Even if that's not our intention, we may end up sort of reinforcing these deeply racialized ideas in the interest of protecting one particular group, in this case, women. So the fight for social justice for one group essentially must not be at the expense of another. We really have to build these kind of solidarities around the need to challenge the cold climate, challenge the ways in which the systems and the protection, the spaces for protection are narrowing, without suggesting that somehow one group is more of a legitimate beneficiary than others, that actually there's an equal right to have access to protection. And we don't want to, if you like, play one group off against another, because that's exactly what governments are currently doing in their own practice. Not easy solutions, I know, and more theoretical, but I'll stop there and we'll maybe come back to some of the detail after Sandra's had a chance to talk about the specifics. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a brief overview of the agenda. I'll provide some of our most recent figures to give a snapshot of the current situation of displaced and stateless persons. And then I'll give a very short overview of the frameworks and policies that guides UNHCR's work on gender equality. And here I'll also briefly touch on the organization's policy on protection from gender-based violence. It sits in a different policy. I'll also briefly talk about accountability to affected populations and our approach to further the meaningful participation of displaced and stateless persons throughout our work. So it'll hopefully fit well into what you just presented on Heaven. And then I'll move on to some of the challenges we're facing and also some of the opportunities we're trying to use as entry points. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so UNHCR is currently present in 135 countries, and we have more than 20,000 personnel across the globe. And the persons who fall under our mandate don't just extend to refugees, but also asylum seekers and returnees, so refugees returning home, internally displaced persons, and stateless people. And as of August this year, the total number of displaced persons amounted to 110 million people, as you see on the screen. But more recent figures that I've seen, I just had trouble verifying them, but I believe that the number is now actually a staggering 114 million people. And UNHCR predicts that by the end of the year, it will amount to 117 million. So we're at a record high level of displacement. About 35 million are refugees, so the majority are really internally displaced. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm really sorry for the text-heavy slide here, but I believe that the slides will be shared after the seminar, so you can return to these later. But just to highlight a few significant stats, we know that about 75% of those in need of international protection are hosted in low and middle-income countries. We also know that 97% of refugees cross just one border when seeking protection, and so the vast majority are hosted in neighboring countries. As I said, the number of displacement is at an all-time high and are only predicted to grow. Women and girls constitute about half of those who are affected by displacement. And I think that's a good segue to the next slide, which brings me to our policy on age, gender, and diversity. Thank you. So we don't have a standalone gender policy, but rather a policy that seeks to address AGD, age, gender, and diversity more broadly. And that's to ensure and promote a more effective and indeed intersectional approach throughout our protection work. So the policy has 10 commitments, and they all speak to empowerment and inclusion and accountability, but 5 specifically seek to further the rights and empowerment of women and girls. And the first relates to the meaningful participation of women and girls in management and leadership structures. So we know that displaced and stateless women are often excluded from some really key decision-making fora. So with this commitment, we really want to ensure that women have a seat at the table in the decisions that affect their lives. So for example, that could be a camp committee in a refugee camp, where we strongly advocate to have gender parity on these committees. The second relates to individual registration and documentation, and that's to ensure that all women and girls are provided with their own documentation. And so from a gender perspective, the risk here is really related to statelessness. So here we're looking at gender discriminatory policies and practices in some countries that prevent women from independently accessing birth certificates and identity documentation for their children. And so these documents are, of course, often necessary for children to acquire nationality, and are then unable to access a broad range of services, including education or healthcare and a range of other social services. Some of you may be familiar with UNHCR's I Belong campaign. It seeks to end statelessness by 2024. I hope we'll get there. I don't know that we will. We still have about 25 countries where reform is needed so that women can confer their nationalities to their children. But the campaign has proved quite successful in a number of countries, and I believe Madagascar and Sierra Leone were the first to change their laws after the campaign was launched. So the third commitment relates to the equal access to and control over core relief items and also cash assistance. So UNHCR has really scaled up our work on cash as part of our humanitarian responses. And that's because the organization believes that it helps to improve choice and dignity and accountability. But it also helps to mitigate some of the risks for the people that we work with and for. Do not resort to negative coping mechanisms. So for example, selling sex. And so in the 46 countries that are using Cash Assist, which is the name of our cash program, about 52 cash recipients were women. So that's definitely an area that's seeing a lot of progress. Then The fourth commitment relates to the equal access to health and education and livelihoods opportunities. So here we're really trying to focus on education and career opportunities for women and girls. It also creates resilience in times of displacements. And so we know that women, of course, face an array of additional barriers on top of being displaced to livelihood opportunities. So, for example, having access to affordable childcare or women taking on caregiving roles. We know that also from non-displacement contexts, of course. But a good example here is my favorite example is Made 51. Some of you might be familiar. If you ever shop at Uniqlo, you might have seen some of these projects. So with this project, 90% of the products are made by refugee women. I know that some of you are attending the Global Refugee Forum next month, and so I can really encourage you to visit the pop-up store that I know Made 51 will have at the venue. So for the fifth commitment, it really relates to our GBV protection work. But here, actually, if I could go to the next slide. Thank you. So since so this policy, the AGD policy came out in 2018, and since then we now have launched a standalone policy on gender-based violence protection. So in practice, we broadly organize our work there in 3 areas, which you can see on the screen. So our work on prevention seeks to address the root causes of GBV from it happening in the first place. Then response is always a key priority in all of our operations, and this refers to health services, legal, safety, safe houses, education, and also livelihood sectors. And this is carefully coordinated with our partners on the ground, where we use standardized tools and also adhere to a set of minimum standards for quality assurance. And then risk mitigation is also a priority across all areas. It requires us to ensure that our programming does not increase the risk of harm, so the do no harm principle, and that we also regularly consult with women and girls to inform the design and implementation while monitoring for unintended consequences, and then, of course, promptly adjusting as based on the needs. Now, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I felt really strongly that I needed to include this slide on accountability to affected populations, or AP, and meaningful participation. It also feeds well into what you presented on just before, Heaven. I recognize I don't have the time to really unpack this in a way that it truly deserves, but just briefly, when we talk about AP, we're talking about the organization's responsibility to ensure that any concerns or needs, and of course the voices of the people impacted by our work are heard and respected and addressed. And so if we look at this little AP wheel, if you will, it includes transparency. So we need to provide clear information about our actions and decisions and the resources we have available to affected populations. It's about feedback and response mechanisms. So we need to ensure that we establish communication channels for affected populations so that they can voice their concerns and provide feedback. And then it's, of course, about our responsiveness to that feedback and make adjustments based on that feedback. It also is underpinned by learning and improving our work. So we constantly learn from the previous work that we do. And then it's, of course, very much about meaningful participation. So involving communities in decision-making processes and allowing them to contribute to the design and implementation and evaluation of intervention is absolutely key and something that we always strive to do. And a good practice of meaningful participation as well. So I've just included this one on the advisory board. So UNHCR's task team on engagement and partnership with organizations led by persons under our mandate was created to align our internal efforts and support the many work streams we have on engaging and partnering with displaced and stateless persons. So the advisory board really guides us in a number of areas, of course, on how we best engage with organizations that are led by displaced persons, but also how we can create a repository of development capacity building material to enhance these partnerships. They do a number of other things, but these are just to highlight some of the key examples. The advisory board is made up by people with lived experience, and there are about 15 to 25 members at any given time on the board. And the board must really ensure that members are diverse in ages and genders and ethnicities and religious beliefs and so on. And so that was just to provide very few words on AP and meaningful participation, but yeah, there's a lot more to unpack, but if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so for the challenges, there are plenty, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but just some of the few that we really cannot get around not highlighting. So the first is related to norms. This is, of course, the root of all inequalities, and it's what hinders girls' access to education in Afghanistan, for example, or how women in Qatar or Yemen can't confer the nationality to their children. So we saw during COVID that the progress that we had seen in dismantling some of these barriers and creating positive norms were really set back. But we've tried to really pick up on a lot of the good initiatives that were there pre-COVID as well. So some of the work we do here, of course, is through our campaigns and advocacy. I've already mentioned the I Belong campaign to end statelessness. At the moment, we are currently in the middle of the annual campaign of 16 Days Against Violence Against Women. So both are examples of what we try to do in terms of advocacy, but our work also includes working with a really wide range of stakeholders and partners on the ground, including community leaders or faith-based organizations, to ensure that broad buy-in is there when we do our programming. The second challenge is related to the increase of conflicts and wars. And the fact that more conflicts are increasingly more protracted. So between 22 and 23, we saw the highest number in decades. And again, we have, of course, the record high number of people who are displaced. We also have a record high number of countries on our risk countries list in our risk register, and that's updated on a quarterly basis. We're also seeing more emergencies than ever that are unforeseen. So Ukraine and Sudan, and of course Gaza more recently. We of course don't have a mandate in the Gaza conflict, but just to highlight that the number that of emergencies that we aren't exactly or that we didn't foresee increasing as well. 23 of the 33 armed conflicts that took place last year occurred in countries with low levels of gender equality, with 3 occurring with medium levels of gender equality according to the Global Gender Equality Index. All right, underfunding, I won't spend a lot of time on this point, just to say that the increase of conflicts and number of displaced persons, the reduced funding funding constraints pose obvious challenges in our strive to effectively provide quality protection, and pose an obvious challenge also in delivering on those 5 commitments that I presented on earlier. The climate crisis is also worth highlighting. So it's important to say that, of course, forcibly displaced women and girls always are at heightened risk of the few points I'll highlight now, but that the climate crisis absolutely exacerbates them. So the first one relates to limited resilience and limited capacity to adapt due to multiple barriers. So, for example, the limited access to formalized technologies and information. And so here we're back again at to the 10 core commitments of the AGD policy. So we know that displaced and stateless women and girls have, for example, lower levels of literacy compared to their male counterparts, including digital literacy, which is of course crucial to, for example, receive warnings or life-saving information about where to get help when a disaster strikes. Harmful coping mechanisms, I've already mentioned these, so that could be the exchange of sex or child marriage. We've seen this a lot in the eastern horn of Africa due to extreme droughts. So to gain income, young girls are married off to receive, so the household receives dowries. And we know that these girls are becoming younger and younger when they're married off. Unsustainably harvested biomass, so for example, firewood. Women are usually the ones undertaking the cooking duties in the household. So indoor air pollution are really increasing their health risks. And then also when gathering firewood, women and children are exposed to the risk of gender-based violence, which we also know occurs. I should also say climate change also exposes men to structural vulnerabilities. So loss of livelihoods during crisis increase the risk of dying by suicide. And then we've also seen that, for example, in Chad, where farmers struggle to find alternative livelihoods during times of droughts, there's a heightened risk of these men to be recruited by armed groups. All right, for the opportunities, please. So next slide. Thank you. So first we have gender mainstreaming and targeted actions. I won't spend a lot of time here either, but this is really to address harmful gender norms that we looked at in the previous slide. So we're trying to do that through positive masculinities programming. We also recently did a digital gender inclusion and innovation bootcamp in MENA and Eastern Horn of Africa for women and refugee-led organizations to provide digital training, but also funding for project proposals that the participants came up with. So that's an example of a good practice. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the participation by displaced and stateless women in it. So although forcibly displaced women are often the first responders in conflict or crisis settings, they are significantly underrepresented in peace building and formal peace processes. So this is an area we have really scaled up on in recent years. So first through our board membership in the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund. So there the fund provides funding to women-led organizations working on the inclusion of women in peace processes. And so as a board member, we've really advocated for the fund to specifically target organizations led by refugees or internally displaced or stateless women. And about a quarter of the approved grants have been funded to organizations led by forcibly displaced persons. So due to our advocacy as a board member, so we're quite proud of that, and we're really encouraged to see that positive development. We're also a board member of and signatory to the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Action Compact. And the compact is really a call for action to include women in the Women, Peace and Security agenda as well. And so what they also call for is this larger redesign of humanitarian processes to systemically and meaningfully include women and girls, including refugees and forcibly displaced and stateless women and girls. And so there we try to share the good practices we have in providing GBV response services and also in furthering the participation of women and girls. I will leave it there in the interest of time. So the next one, supporting refugees and women-led organizations. So this is really connected to our work on furthering localization in our work. So as a good example, we're looking to scale up our support to women-led organizations through flexible funding mechanisms. So what we see is there's a lot of reluctance to provide funding to non-registered organizations. And this is because it's incredibly hard for refugees to, because of their legal status, to obtain that registration that many donors require. So in turn, they don't receive any or only very limited support. So this is a really a key area that UNHCR has been looking into scaling up support to, and also something we have worked together with the fund I mentioned before, the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, on including support to non-registered organizations. On climate actions, we're trying to address this through our programs whenever it's possible A good example includes our work in Algeria, where we're trying to recycle plastic and waste available in the camps and process them and make them into useful products that can then generate an income for the women in the camp. It also, of course, includes taking a good look at our own footprint by using, so we're trying to use more green energy and scaling up the use of solar panels when we provide our response. Okay, if we can move to the next and final slide. Thank you. I think it's hard to get around the Global Refugee Forum when we're talking about opportunities. It's a few weeks away, and I know some of you are attending, as I said. So a quick recap of what the forum is really about. It's designed to promote responsibility sharing among host countries and communities to better support refugees. It has these 4 objectives that you see on the screen. And every 4 years, we have the Global Refugee Forum, where the focus is really to take stock of where we are at on the compact and to learn from each other, so share good practices, and also to pledge on the compact and achieving the objectives. So in terms of pledges on the screen, you'll see some of the examples of the multi-stakeholder pledges we're seeing, where there's a strong focus on gender. The first is self-explanatory, but the others also include some good examples of where there's a strong gender focus, which is really encouraging. I'll hyperlink to the different pledges when the slides are shared, so you can learn more after the seminar. It's also important to note that we explicitly emphasize that an AGD approach is critical for the success of the compact. And the compact also has made specific commitments to upholding the rights of everyone, being inclusive of age, gender, and diversity or disability considerations. A recent analysis of the pledges show that only 30% of the pledges consider or reference AGD, so there's some way to go. But we really do see the compact and the forum as crucial entry points to further our work on gender equality and women's empowerment.